The sterile duke thought he'd never have a child, but the widow made him the father of twins. The chapel bells of St Albans rang out across London's grey morning sky, as Duke Leopold Ashford stood before the altar, a squirming infant in his arms. Around him, the ton whispered behind gloved hands and painted fans. Such a pity. All that land and no heir. At least he dotes on someone's children. Leopold felt their eyes like pinpricks on his back, but his attention remained fixed on the tiny boy, clutching his ducal cravat with surprisingly strong fingers. Beside him, Mrs. Helena Weston, draped in black mourning silk, held the child's twin sister with practised ease. The vicar's voice echoed through the stone chapel. "And may you guide them, your grace, as a father in all but name." The word struck Leopold like a physical blow. Father. The title he'd been told 3 years ago he would never claim. The dream he'd buried alongside his broken engagement and shattered pride. Baby Thomas chose that moment to grab Leopold's nose with chubby fingers, and despite everything, despite the whispers and the weight of his impossible situation, Leopold smiled. The christening ceremony for Captain Bram Weston's twins was bittersweet. Bram had been Leopold's closest friend since their army days, the only man who'd stood by him after the fever that left Leopold's body whole but his future childless. When the railway accident took Bram 4 months ago, Leopold had wept for the first time since his diagnosis. Now he stood as godfather to Bram's children, a role that felt both like an honour and a cruel reminder of what he could never have. After the ceremony, Helena approached him in the chapel's side room, both twins now mercifully asleep in their basket. "Thank you for stepping in as guardian," she said, her voice tired but steady. "Bram always said you were the most honourable man he knew." Leopold studied her properly for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 26, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of exhausted determination. "Bram trusted me with what mattered most to him," he replied. "I won't take that lightly." Before Helena could respond, baby Clara made a small sound and promptly spit up on Leopold's perfectly pressed coat. Helena's hands flew to her mouth in horror, but Leopold surprised himself by laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in what felt like years. "It seems your daughter has rendered judgment on ducal fashion," he said, attempting to wipe the mess with his handkerchief. Helena's shoulders relaxed slightly, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched her lips. "Clara has always had strong opinions," she said softly. That night, alone in his study with brandy and legal papers, Leopold signed the guardianship documents Bram's will had outlined. The solicitor, an elderly man who'd served the Ashford family for decades, remarked as Leopold's pen scratched across parchment, "In practice, Your Grace, you'll be a father to them. Everything but the name." Leopold stared at the ink drying over his signature, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. "A sterile duke," he whispered, half in wonder, half in pain. "And yet somehow a father of twins?" 1. 5 days after the christening, Helena Weston sat in the cramped townhouse Bram had rented before his death, fighting back tears as both twins wailed in perfect, ear-splitting harmony. The milk bill sat unpaid on the table beside an increasingly stern letter from her late husband's creditors. Bram had been brave, loyal, and utterly terrible with money. His gambling debts and unpaid loans were now being called in, and Helena's small widow's pension wouldn't begin to cover them. The worst part was the letter from Bram's mother, written in careful, cold script. "We propose to take young Thomas to raise properly in the country. You may, of course, keep the girl." Helena had crumpled the letter in her fist, rage and fear warring in her chest. They wanted to split her children, tear them apart, because they deemed a widowed mother with debts too scandalous to keep both over her dead body. She'd arranged a meeting with Duke Leopold at his London house that afternoon, leaving the twins with her one trusted friend, a former army nurse named Mrs. Price. As Helena waited in Leopold's formal drawing room, surrounded by paintings of noble Ashford ancestors, she felt acutely aware of her worn black dress and scuffed boots. This was a mistake. What could a duke possibly do about her problems? When Leopold entered, he looked different than he had at the christening, more guarded, more carefully composed. "Mrs. Weston," he greeted her formally. "How may I assist you?" Helena had prepared a polite speech, but exhaustion made her blunt. "I need help negotiating with my late husband's creditors," she said, "and I need to ensure that the guardianship you've accepted doesn't give Bram's family grounds to separate my children." Leopold's expression shifted, calculation flickering behind his eyes. He gestured for her to sit and listened without interruption as she laid out her situation. The debts, the pressure from Bram's family, the impossible choice between poverty and splitting her twins. When she finished, silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of an enormous grandfather clock. "There is a solution," Leopold said finally, his voice careful, "though you may find it unconventional." Helena's stomach tightened. "I'm listening." Leopold stood, moving to the window as if he couldn't meet her eyes for what came next. "Your position is precarious. A widowed mother with debts and twins is vulnerable to fortune hunters and scandal. My position is also precarious, in a different way. My ducal line needs stability and the appearance of an heir, but everyone in society knows I cannot father children." Helena's breath caught. He couldn't mean what she thought he meant. Leopold turned to face her, his expression painfully honest. "If you marry me, I can pay Bram's debts honourably. You and the twins will live securely in my household. The children will be publicly acknowledged as being under my protection, raised as if my own." He paused, and Helena saw vulnerability flicker across his aristocratic features. "I cannot give you more children. The doctors say it is unlikely after a fever I contracted during the war. But I can give your existing ones a future." Helena stood abruptly, her mind reeling. "You're proposing marriage, a marriage of arrangement?" "Yes," Leopold said simply. "I won't dress it up as romance or affection, but it would solve both our problems." Helena's first instinct was to refuse. She'd promised herself, after Bram's death, that she'd never marry for convenience, never trade herself for security. Bram had been a love match, messy and chaotic and real. But as she thought of Thomas and Clara, of the letter proposing to split them, her resolve wavered. Before she could respond, a maid burst into the room carrying Clara, whose gown was thoroughly soiled. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace, but I was told to bring Miss Clara to her mamma immediately." The maid looked mortified. Leopold, without hesitation, crossed the room and took the baby from the flustered servant. "It's quite all right," he said, rolling up his sleeves with surprising competence. "Mrs. Weston and I are discussing important matters. We can manage a minor crisis." Helena watched, stunned, as the Duke of Ashford changed her daughter's soiled clothing with practiced efficiency, murmuring nonsense words that made Clara giggle. When he looked up and caught Helena staring, he had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I spent time in army field hospitals," he explained. After a while, nothing surprises you. Something in Helena's chest shifted. This man, this careful, controlled duke, was already behaving like a father. "I'll consider your offer," Helena said finally, accepting Clara back from him. "But I have conditions." Leopold nodded. "I would expect nothing less." Helena met his eyes steadily. If I marry you, your grace, it will not be as your scandal or your convenience. It will be as the woman whose twins you claim in full daylight, without shame or secrecy. For the first time since she'd entered his house, Leopold smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Mrs. Weston, he said, I would have it no other way. 2. 1 week later, after Bram's creditors had grown more aggressive and his family more insistent about taking Thomas, Helena agreed to Leopold's proposal. But she came to him with a written list of conditions, which she presented in his study with Clara, balanced on one hip and determination in her eyes. First, she said, not bothering with preamble, I keep full maternal authority over the twins' day-to-day care. I won't be reduced to a decorative duchess while nursemaids raise my children. Leopold nodded. Agreed. Second, they are presented publicly as Bram's children, but emotionally as yours. You will not keep them at arm's length or treat this as a business arrangement when it comes to them. Leopold's throat tightened. That will be easier than you think. Third, Helena continued, I have a say in running the ducal household. I won't be silent decoration. Leopold actually smiled at that. Mrs. Weston, if I wanted silent decoration, I would have married a portrait. Helena's lips twitched despite herself. Then Leopold added his own boundary, his voice dropping. I have one condition of my own. No pressure about heirs. No physicians examining me. No treatments. No pointed questions about why your belly doesn't swell with my child. I will not endure a second engagement crumbling over my sterility. The pain in his words made Helena's chest ache. Agreed, she said softly. They married 3 weeks later at Leopold's country estate, Ashford Hall. It was a small ceremony, attended only by immediate family and a handful of close friends. Leopold's mother, the Dowager Duchess, was relieved but stiff, barely concealing her hope that Helena might somehow provide the grandson she'd long given up expecting. Society whispered, of course. The Ton always whispered. But the official story was acceptable. The Duke marries his fallen comrade's widow out of duty and compassion. Noble, charitable, entirely proper. The new domestic reality proved more chaotic than Leopold had anticipated. Helena moved into Ashford Hall with both twins, who seemed determined to disrupt every aristocratic tradition the ancient house possessed. During their first formal dinner, with Leopold's mother present, both babies began wailing in perfect harmony from the nursery upstairs. The Dowager Duchess pursed her lips. The nurse should handle that, she said icily. Leopold surprised everyone, including himself, by standing. Bring them down, he told the hovering footman. His mother's face went white. Leopold, you cannot be serious. Infants at the dinner table? It's my table, Leopold said mildly, and they're my children. The words slipped out before he'd thought them through. His mother's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Helena, he noticed, was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Slowly, carefully, they built something that resembled a family. Leopold found himself wandering to the nursery at odd hours, drawn by sounds of laughter or crying, or simply the warm presence of life. One evening, Helena discovered him asleep in the large armchair, Thomas sprawled across his chest, and Clara drooling contentedly on a parliamentary report he'd been reading. She didn't wake him, just pulled a blanket over them and left quietly. They began sharing quiet evenings after the twins were asleep, talking over brandy and tea. Helena told him about her life before Bram, about growing up the daughter of a country vicar, about how she'd shocked her family by choosing an army captain with more courage than fortune. Leopold found himself telling her about the war, about the fever that left him sterile, about the fiancé who'd ended their engagement when the doctors delivered their diagnosis. She said she couldn't marry half a man, Leopold admitted one night, the words bitter even 2 years later. Helena's expression turned fierce. Then she was a fool who didn't deserve you. The loyalty in her voice warmed something in Leopold's chest that had been cold for a very long time. But not everyone was supportive. At a family dinner, 6 weeks into the marriage, Leopold's cousin Richard made a pointed observation. "Convenient, isn't it?" Richard said, swirling his wine. "The sterile duke suddenly devoted to twins. I wonder what society will think when they're old enough to look like someone." The implication was clear and cruel. Helena went pale. Leopold's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you suggesting, Richard?" "Nothing at all," Richard said with false innocence. "Simply that some might wonder whether your condition was as permanent as claimed." The rest of the dinner passed in frozen politeness. That night, Leopold couldn't sleep. He found himself in the nursery, watching the twins sleep in their cribs, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Helena appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown. "If they were truly mine," Leopold said quietly, not looking at her, "it would be simpler. People might stop counting months and whispering." Helena moved to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his. "They already are yours," she said firmly. "You're the one who gets up at 3 in the morning when Thomas screams. You're the one who walks Clara around the garden when she won't settle. That's what makes you their father." Leopold turned to look at her, seeing in the low lamplight something he hadn't allowed himself to name. Helena met his gaze steadily. In that moment, both of them realized the emotional truth was outrunning the legal one. This marriage of convenience was becoming something far more complicated and far more real. 3. 6 months into their marriage, Leopold and Helena were required to appear at Lady Ashworth's ball for the London season. Helena, now Duchess of Ashford, wore deep green silk that Leopold had insisted she purchase. "You're a duchess," he'd said when she'd protested the expense. "Not a nun." The twins, now plump and charming at 8 months old, had been left with their devoted nurse, though both parents had delayed leaving twice to check on them. At the ball, Helena felt every eye tracking her movements. Women whispered behind fans. Men appraised her with barely concealed speculation. She heard the fragments. "Convenient arrangement. Those twins. I wonder if the Duke is truly as sterile as claimed." Leopold's hand found hers, squeezing briefly. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They have nothing better to do than gossip." But the whispers turned into something worse when a man approached them near the refreshment table. Bram's brother, Edward Weston, looked nothing like his late sibling. Where Bram had been warm and laughing, Edward was cold and sharp. "Sister," he said to Helena, the word dripping with contempt. "And your grace. How touching to see family solidarity." Leopold tensed beside her. Edward had refused to attend the wedding, had refused all contact since Bram's death. His sudden appearance now couldn't be accidental. "Edward," Helena said carefully, "what brings you to London?" "Legal matters," Edward said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Specifically, matters concerning my brother's children. I've been consulting with solicitors about custody arrangements." Helena's blood went cold. Leopold's voice cut across the sudden tension. "The twins are well cared for and legally under my guardianship, as outlined in Bram's will." "A will written when Bram assumed you'd remain unmarried," Edward countered. "Circumstances have changed. I'm petitioning the courts for custody. Those children are Westons, not Ashfords. Their identity is being erased by your convenient arrangement." The accusation hit Helena like a slap. She'd been terrified of exactly this, of Bram being forgotten, of her children losing connection to their father's memory. "How dare you?" she started, but Edward wasn't finished. You sold yourself to a duke, he said flatly. Traded my brother's children for a title and security. I intend to ensure they remember who their real father was. Leopold stepped forward, his aristocratic composure cracking. You will not speak to my wife that way. Your wife? Edward sneered. How long before you're parading those twins as your heirs? Everyone knows you can't father children of your own. How convenient that two appeared just when your line needed saving. The ball had gone quiet around them. Helena felt tears of fury and humiliation burning behind her eyes. The ride home was silent and terrible. Leopold stared out the carriage window. Helena clutched her reticule until her knuckles went white. Once inside Ashford Hall, the argument erupted. He has no right, Helena said, her voice shaking. No right to question how we're raising them. He has every right, Leopold replied harshly. He's blood family. I'm just the convenient guardian who stepped in. Is that truly what you think? Helena demanded. That you're just convenient? What else am I? Leopold's control finally shattered. I can't give you children, Helena. Everyone knows it. Every time we appear in public with the twins, people count months and make calculations and whisper about whether the sterile duke is truly sterile after all. Edward is right. I'm clinging to children who will never carry my name, who will never truly be mine. They are yours, Helena's voice broke. In every way that matters, they are yours. Blood matters, Leopold said bitterly. In courts, in society, blood is what matters. And they have my name, but not my blood. Helena stared at him, seeing the old wound torn open, the shame and pain he'd tried to bury. If that's what you believe, she said quietly, then perhaps Edward is right about the nature of our arrangement. She left him standing in his study and retreated to the guest wing, taking both twins with her. For 3 days, they maintained careful distance. Leopold buried himself in estate business. Helena cared for the twins in increasing isolation. But Ashford Hall felt wrong without the sounds of family, and both of them felt the absence like a physical ache. On the 4th day, formal legal documents arrived. Edward Weston was petitioning for partial custody, claiming that Helena had been unduly influenced by Leopold's wealth and title, and that the children's Western identity was being systematically erased. Helena read the papers with shaking hands, then sent a note to Leopold's study. We need to talk. They met in the library, both exhausted, both wary. Helena spoke first. I need to tell you something I've been afraid to admit. Leopold waited. She took a breath. Part of me has been afraid to let you fully become their father, because it feels like betraying Bram, like I'm erasing him by letting you step into his place. But that's not fair to you or to them. Leopold's expression softened. I would never want to erase Bram. I know, Helena said. I know that now. But I need you to understand something too. She moved closer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You are their father, Leopold, not because of guardianship papers or marriage contracts, because you love them, because they reach for you when they're frightened and laugh when you make silly faces and fall asleep feeling safe in your arms. Leopold's carefully maintained composure cracked. The doctors said, he started, his voice rough. They said I was less than a man, that I would never know what it meant to be a father. My last fiancée couldn't even look at me after the diagnosis. She said she deserved better than half a husband. The old pain was raw in his words. Helena closed the distance between them, taking his hands in hers. You are not half anything, she said fiercely. You are the man who sits up all night when Thomas has nightmares. The man who learned to change nappies because you refused to leave it all to servants. The man who reads to Clara, even though she can't possibly understand the words yet, just because you want her to hear your voice. Tears slipped down her cheeks. You may not have given them life, Leo, but you've given them a home. That should matter in any court worth respecting. Leopold pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time since his diagnosis, he let himself weep. For the years of shame, for the lost dreams, for the family he'd found despite everything. Helena held him tightly, and somewhere in that embrace, the careful boundaries of their marriage of convenience finally dissolved into something true. 4. The informal hearing took place in a private room at the magistrate's office. Not a grand courtroom, but a wood-panelled chamber that smelled of old books and furniture polish. Present were Edward Weston and his stern-faced solicitor, Leopold and Helena, with their own legal counsel, and Magistrate Thornbury, a silver-haired man known for fairness and impatience with nonsense. Edward's solicitor presented his case with cold precision. The twins were Westons by blood. Their mother had been unduly influenced by the Duke's wealth and title during a period of grief and financial desperation. Most damningly, he argued, Leopold was using the children to patch his reputation as the sterile Duke, to provide the appearance of heirs his condition made impossible. In essence, the solicitor concluded, these children are being used as convenient props in a marriage of mutual benefit, while their true identity and heritage are being systematically erased. Helena's hands clenched in her lap. Leopold sat rigid beside her. When their turn came, Helena spoke first, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mr. Weston claims to care about my children's heritage, she said, meeting Edward's eyes directly. Where was this concern when my husband died? Where was the offer of help when I couldn't pay the milk bill? Where was family loyalty when your mother suggested splitting the twins because a widowed mother with debts was too scandalous? Edward's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Helena continued, her voice gaining strength. The Duke of Ashford supported us from the beginning. Not because he needed heirs, not because it benefited his reputation, but because he loved Bram, and he honoured his friend's memory by protecting his family. My children know Leopold as Papa, and me as Mama. Mr. Weston is a stranger who appeared only after we found security. She pulled folded papers from her reticule. I've brought documentation, every letter I wrote to the Weston family asking for help, every request that went unanswered, every debt Leopold paid that Bram's family ignored. She placed them on the table. If Mr. Weston is so concerned about heritage, let him explain his absence when heritage needed defending. Magistrate Thornbury examined the documents with keen eyes. Then he turned to Leopold. Your Grace, you've been notably silent. What is your position in this matter? Leopold stood, not because protocol demanded it, but because the words he needed to say required him to face them all directly. Magistrate Thornbury, when my physicians told me I would likely never father children, I believed my life had ended before it truly began. I grieved for years for a future I thought I'd lost. His voice was calm, but carried weight. Then my closest friend died, and his widow appeared at my door with 2 infants and impossible debts. I could have paid those debts and walked away. Many would say that was the proper aristocratic response. But when Thomas grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go, when Clara fell asleep on my shoulder, I realized something. He paused, meeting Edward's hostile gaze. Fatherhood isn't about blood. It's about showing up. It's about the 3 a.m. feedings and the endless nappy changes and the way your heart stops when they run fever. Leopold's voice roughened with emotion. Mr. Weston asks what makes me their father. I'll tell you, it's Thomas reaching for me when he has nightmares. It's Clara laughing at my terrible attempts at lullabies. It's the fact that when my godson cries, it's my shoulder he reaches for, and when my goddaughter laughs, she grabs my finger and won't let go." He looked directly at the magistrate. "If that does not make me their father, then the word has lost all meaning." Silence filled the room. Even Edward's solicitor looked uncertain. Magistrate Thornbury studied Leopold for a long moment, then turned to Edward. "Mr. Weston, do you love these children?" Edward seemed taken aback. "They're my brother's offspring." "That's not what I asked. Do you love them?" Edward struggled visibly. "I barely know them." "Precisely," Thornbury said quietly. The magistrate's ruling came after a brief recess. Primary custody would remain with Helena as the children's mother. Leopold would continue his role as guardian and stepfather. However, Edward would receive structured visitation rights, ensuring the twins maintained connection to their Western heritage. These children, Thornbury concluded, deserve to know where they came from, but they also deserve stability, love, and parents who demonstrate daily commitment. This arrangement provides both. After the hearing, Edward approached Leopold and Helena in the corridor. His expression was no longer hostile, just tired. "I genuinely believed," he said quietly, "that you were using them." Leopold met his eyes steadily. "I am using them. To teach me what being a father means. To show me that family isn't only about blood. To give my life meaning I thought I'd lost forever." Edward watched through the open door as their nurse brought the twins into the waiting room. Thomas immediately reached for Leopold with a cry of, "Papa!" Leopold scooped him up, and the boy buried his face in Leopold's neck with complete trust. Edward saw it then, the bond that couldn't be fabricated or forced. Bram, Edward said finally, chose his friend well. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Helena nodded. "Bram loved your brother. We'll make sure Thomas and Clara know that." 5. 1 year after the hearing, Leopold stood in Ashford Hall's gardens, watching toddlers run with the determined chaos that only 18-month-olds could achieve. Thomas had discovered mud puddles and was systematically destroying his third best outfit. Clara had found a butterfly and was pursuing it with single-minded focus that would inevitably end in tears when it escaped. Helena appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Your mother asked if we'd be attending the Ashworth ball next month," she said. Leopold groaned. "Must we?" "I'm afraid so. Ducal obligations and all that," she smiled. "Though I understand if you'd rather stay home with your children." The possessive pronoun warmed him every time. "Our children," he corrected gently. "Always ours." They'd built something he'd never imagined during those dark days after his diagnosis. Not a fairy tale romance, but something better. A genuine partnership earned through crisis and choice. Helena was his wife not by arrangement, but by affection. The twins were his children, not by blood, but by daily presence and love. "You know," Helena said, watching Clara abandon the butterfly to chase her brother instead, "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit," Leopold teased. She elbowed him lightly. "I've been thinking that we should tell them the truth when they're older. About Bram, about how we came to be a family. All of it." Leopold considered this. "Even the difficult parts?" "Especially the difficult parts," Helena said firmly. "They should know their father was brave and loved them. They should know you chose to become their papa, even though you didn't have to. They should know that family is something you build, not just something you're born into." Leopold pulled her close, resting his chin on her head. "When did you become so wise?" "When a sterile duke proposed marriage and turned out to be the best father 2 chaotic toddlers could ask for." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Thomas discover that mud was excellent for flinging at one's sister. Clara shrieked in protest. Leopold sighed. I should intervene before they're completely unsalvageable. But before he could move, Thomas spotted him and came running, muddy arms outstretched. "Papa! Papa! Look!" He held up a worm with such pride that Leopold couldn't help but laugh. Clara arrived seconds later, also muddy, also demanding attention. Leopold crouched to their level, letting them climb on him despite the destruction of his afternoon coat. "What have you two discovered?" he asked, and launched into a very serious discussion about worms and butterflies and mud. Helena watched her family with a full heart. A year ago she'd been drowning in debt and desperation. Now she was watching her children be loved by a man who'd believed himself broken. Leopold looked up and caught her expression. "What?" he asked. "Just thinking," she said, "about how strange life is." Thomas chose that moment to shove a muddy handful of grass at Leopold's face. Clara thought this was hilarious and did the same. Leopold accepted his fate with remarkable grace, letting both toddlers decorate him with garden debris while explaining very seriously why gentlemen typically did not wear mud. Helena laughed until tears ran down her face. Later, after the twins had been bathed and fed and were finally asleep in their nursery, Leopold and Helena sat in their private sitting room. He'd inherited this room from his father, and it still carried traces of Ashford history in every corner. But Helena's books were on the shelves now, and children's toys lived in a basket by the fire. "Do you ever regret it?" Leopold asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of choosing your own path?" Helena looked at him, at this man who'd become far more than a marriage of convenience. "Never," she said firmly. "Do you regret taking on a widow and her complicated children?" Leopold thought about the question seriously. He thought about the years of shame and grief, about believing he was half a man because he couldn't father children. He thought about the first time Thomas called him Papa, and the way Clara reached for him when she was frightened. "I used to mourn what I couldn't have," he said slowly. "I defined myself by what was missing. Then a widow knocked on my door and handed me 2 entire universes." He met Helena's eyes. "You gave me fatherhood when I'd accepted I would never know it. How could I possibly regret that?" Helena crossed the room to sit beside him. "We gave it to each other," she corrected. "You gave my children safety and love. I gave you family." They sat together in the firelight, not speaking, just being present. Upstairs, a faint wail emerged. Clara having a nightmare. Without discussion, Leopold rose to go to her. Helena followed. They stood together in the nursery doorway, watching Leopold lift Clara from her crib and soothe her back to sleep with quiet words and gentle rocking. The title that had once defined him, Sterile Duke, Empty Duke, Duke without heirs, had lost its power completely. Thomas stirred in his crib, reaching out in sleep. Leopold carefully managed to hold both twins, one in each arm, swaying gently. Helena moved to help, but he shook his head slightly. This moment, he wanted to hold on to it. 2 children who didn't share his blood, but shared his heart. 2 small humans who'd taught him that fatherhood was about showing up, about love demonstrated in 1,000 small daily acts. Clara's fingers curled around his collar. Thomas mumbled "Papa" in his sleep. And Leopold realized that somewhere along the way, through crisis and choice and daily commitment, the widow truly had made him a father of twins. Not in spite of his sterility, but because of everything that came after. Because family wasn't about what you could create from your own body, but what you could build with your whole heart. The sterile Duke stood in the lamplight, holding his sleeping children, and knew himself to be the richest man in England.